Discerning the Forums. I'm Nick.
I'm Anthony.
We are joined with Austin Kopack. Austin, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me. How are you guys?
We are good. I'm good.
Hanging in
I
there.
can't speak for Anthony.
No, I'm good. You know,
You're
just
good.
busy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
Life is.
don't know why I
insane.
took the plural form there.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah, we're
Yes,
good.
We're good.
Me, myself, and I are doing well.
Yeah.
That's right. Awesome. Well, this should be a great podcast. We are actually going to talk about Victonstein. And so we got, we're bringing on Austin. You both have A names, so this is going to bother me.
I know.
It's gonna be funny.
I know. No, but I'm excited to have this discussion because, Wittgenstein's just such a famous philosopher, but oftentimes we don't link him with theology. We don't think of him first as a Christian or a theologian. But Austin, you've been studying Wittgenstein, and so before we kind of get into it, can you just tell us a little bit about your studies at St. Andrews?
Yeah. Well, I have only really been working on this project for a couple months now. So
Okay.
in some ways, it's
Nice.
it's still fairly new. But I was first introduced to Wittgenstein back in a hermeneutics course in seminary years ago, and just immediately was enthralled. And so I have continued to come back and have really haven't been able to get away from it. So that was kind of when I was thinking about going on doing PhD work. It was like, okay, if I have to pick one interlocutor, one person that I'm going to engage with and whose ideas I'm going to be working with, I couldn't get away from it. So I was like, okay, I have to do Wittgenstein, and found somebody at St. Andrews who was looking for people to work in Wittgenstein, had overlapping interests, and so it was just kind of an obvious, cool, I got to go hang out there.
That's awesome.
That's really cool.
Now,
what drew you to Wittgenstein? What was like the thing that, obviously we're going to get into this, but I'd like to hear just what was the drawing force for you for why you couldn't get away from it? Like, what was some of the main things that drew you to him?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, like, so we'll obviously get into some of his specific ideas, but if you read, so his main work that he's mostly known for now is the philosophical investigations, and first reading through it, didn't really have any idea what was going on or what he was saying, but I kind of found that as I worked through it, I came to a point where everything just started to look different. Like I got, I got to the end of it, and I just suddenly realized the whole world looked a little bit different than it had before. And it wasn't because at any point he convinced me that this particular idea was wrong or worked through this deductive argument so that therefore now I believe this instead. It was just like, oh, those are really dumb questions I was asking before. Why was I asking those questions? And here's a whole new set of questions and a whole different way of thinking about this. And he just sort of draws you into wrestling with those questions for yourself, in a way that leads you to basically ask different questions. Which
yeah, one thing that always interested me with Wittgenstein is his what was it? He gave a lecture facing backwards or opposite the audience, and I thought, now that's a cool guy. Somebody I need to read. But he sounds like he was a pretty eccentric person.
I didn't know if you wanted me to do any like biographical stuff, because he's one of those people that people, in some ways it's hard to unentwine him, the kind of the person with the thought, because it's just so distinctively him. But anyway, I didn't know if it's helpful to have some context. But so he was born in 1889, so kind of end of the 19th century, in Vienna, Austria, which at the time was, in some ways the height of and the crumbling of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which been for several centuries been this huge empire and power force. And in Europe, and so it's still sort of at the height of its power in some ways in terms of the culture and everything that was going on there at the time. And he was born to his father was an engineer, become this big industrial tycoon in the booming steel industry, and so he was basically the richest man in Vienna, his father. And so their family was incredibly wealthy, and in Vienna that meant that you turned it was kind of like a French saloon sort of salon sort of thing, where you've got writers and thinkers and musicians, and so you just open your house to these people and you'd support them and patronize them. And so they're friends with these great composers and writers and people like Brahms, and his sister's a really good friend of Freud's, and so he's growing up in this sort of aristocratic but incredibly rich environment of music and art and literature. And so that just was his normal, like that was his upbringing, and what he was exposed to growing up, and obviously shaped him quite a bit. He originally was an engineer. He was not not a philosopher, and he went from designing jet propellers, and went from being really interested in the actual shape of the propeller and trying to invent this new way of doing this propeller, that he got interested in like the pure mathematics of it, and then shifted from there to the foundations of mathematics, to eventually to logic and the sort of the question of what even is logic. And that's what eventually moved him into philosophy. But yeah, so it was kind of a circuitous route there.
That's so fascinating. Does he now have it growing up with this aristocratic thing? What was it? Was he also like, he was a mathematician, right? Am I close?
Yeah, so that was, yeah, he did. I mean, he started with engineering and moved into maths,
yeah.
but I mean, that was a
Engineering,
huge thing for him. And it's funny because he was considered the least talented of his siblings. He was just sort of the youngest. He was the youngest of 8, and he was just like, oh, he's he's
Was
little
his
Ludwig.
brother a piano player?
Yeah, one of his brothers
Oh,
was like a famous piano player who lost his arm in World War One.
Oh yeah.
And
Wow.
I can't remember I can't remember which composer it was. But there was a famous composer at the time who then wrote music for him that he could play with one arm.
Oh, interesting.
Wow.
So he could, yeah.
What a crazy,
so yeah,
well-connected life. So well connected. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, it gets even wilder. So like, okay, so he goes and does engineering. Well, first in Germany, then in the UK in Manchester, and then eventually when he's getting into logic, he goes and starts bothering Frege, and he says, "You go talk to Russell." So then he goes to talk to Bertrand Russell at Cambridge, and basically just follows Russell around until he's willing to hang out with him and listen to his ideas. And Russell decides, I think this guy might be brilliant, and so he starts working with him, and he starts working on logic with Russell, even though he's just a student. And World War One happens, so he goes off. He's in the war, and then eventually it gets the end of the war. Throughout that whole time, he's been working on his first book, which is called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And the Tractatus is that's the only thing he actually published, like the only actual book he published in his lifetime. And so he writes that and basically decides, I've solved all the problems in philosophy. Like this is it. I've come to the root of the issue. I figured it out. And so he just basically gives up on doing philosophy to some degree. He decides to go become a school teacher in rural Austria and goes and just teaches elementary school kids in Austria, instead of doing philosophy for a bit. So finally that doesn't work out for him, and he goes and spends 2 years as the architect designing a house for his sister, and builds this like incredible house for her, where just like every detail, like he was known for, he would have the engineers come back because something was off by 1 millimeter, and he would have them like redo the whole thing to get it exactly the precise measurements that he wanted. So he was very meticulous and precise. And then basically through Russell, he was able to get the Tractatus published and get himself a position at Cambridge. And so they gave him a doctorate for it. And then he was at Cambridge until the 40s. And that's where he was teaching and doing a lot of his writing. And basically that was like the rest of his professional life, more or less.
Okay. Now he's famous in the. Oh, go ahead, Anthony.
I was going to say, so his connection with Russell is interesting to me because the only sort of stuff I've read on Wittgenstein was this book called The Return to the Mystical by Peter Tyler, where it's like a book about Wittgenstein and Teresa of Avila and kind of the Christian mystical tradition. Mostly because I was working on a paper on Teresa of Avila, who's one of my favorite saints. And so it's interesting. I like the connection with Christianity. Could you kind of like explain that? Just because he worked so closely with Russell, who is so not Christian, is one of like the major sort of atheist philosophers of the 20th century. Can you just kind of like expound a little bit on on Wittgenstein's sort of connection to Christianity, and if it's what sort of unique stuff he has to offer?
Yeah, it's a really mixed bag, and like he was deeply ambivalent. He grew up Roman Catholic, was baptized, as a child, but really rejected a lot of the dogmatism of it. He didn't like this idea because he didn't think that religion or that sort of theological truths were, in the same way he didn't think this is what his critique of philosophy ends up being, is that it's not on the same level as something like science. So science is making empirical statements about how facts are in the world. The problem is all those facts are contingent. They don't have to be that way. They just happen to be the case. And so this is a big thing for him in the Tractatus, and this is something that Russell just like does not understand. Russell couldn't wrap his head around what Wittgenstein was trying to do, and even in his introduction that Russell wrote for it, Wittgenstein responded like, you completely misunderstood what I was doing, because for him there is this deeply mystical element to it where we can talk about all the contingent facts of the world, but what really matters is what is higher, which is the ethical, the religious, the aesthetic, which for him are all the same thing. I don't know if he'd put it in terms of transcendentals, but beauty, goodness, and truth are one in a sense.
Yeah.
And for him, none of those things can be said. They can be shown. They sort of make themselves shown in the world, but we can't say them because the only things we can say are contingent facts about the world. So anything that basically has value has to be transcendent, and we can't talk about transcendence. Or at least we can't put it into words. We can sort of gesture to it, or we can. He thinks it's sort of it's shown in the way that we talk about the world, but it's not something we can actually say or put into words. If that makes sense. So for him, that's why the Tractatus, is deeply mystical, and the last section of it is basically all mysticism, which I think Russell was just confused by, because he thought, how do you go from solving the problems of logic, which that's great, to this bizarre mystical thing. So in that sense, so that's part of the connection with the mysticism. There are other elements to it. So like, for example, when he's in World War I, and where you start to see that shift in the Tractatus happen, like in his notebook. So in the beginning of World War I, he's doing various things behind the lines, and he's focused on logic, writing about logic, and then he's experiencing more and more kind of frontline action, and you see a shift in his writings to more and more mystical stuff. And at this point, he's reading a lot of Tolstoy on the Gospels, and he became known as the Gospel Man because he's handing out copies of Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief to like everyone who will read it.
The track, no, Tractatus.
Basically, yeah.
Bad joke.
So he saw himself as having this like deeply religious point of view. He read, he thought Augustine was one of the greatest thinkers of all time. He thought Kierkegaard was one of the greatest thinkers of sort of the modern history. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky.
I don't disagree with Kierkegaard, that's for sure. He's one of my favorites, so I don't disagree with that. Maybe Tolstoy. I think he's a little sus, but that's another podcast. Probably.
I like Tolstoy. Yeah, no, that's so interesting. Yeah, so and it's funny because when I think, because when we think of the Tractatus, we think of, like, logical positivism,
Hmm.
and so that just, I think that blows my mind. I think, no, he was more of a mystical Christian, and that is what fueled even the Tractatus? That's so fascinating.
How I was gonna ask you, how influenced do you think he is by, like, German idealism or just idealism in general? Because it sounds like a lot of what he's getting at about what we can and can't talk about, and, like, because he said he doesn't use the word transcendental, which then if you would say that, it'd be like, okay, so, like, idealism is certainly a big part. I'm sure it is a part of his education, right? Like, I assume, but I could be
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah, I mean, he's not actually that well read, at least not early in his life. I mean, later he does delve into more of the sort of history of philosophy, and some theology, but um, there's a lot of overlap with Schopenhauer. I mean, that's not my specialty. It's something I'm will need to
Yeah.
read up on as time goes on.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of stuff in Tractatus around this identification of the self, the metaphysical subject, with the world. The self is the world. I am my world. Um,
Sure.
and that's part of the mystical element of it, is that the self is not in the world. The self is not a thing in the world. The self is the limit of the world, because
Mm.
who's doing the observing? Whose world is it? Well, it
Right.
can only be my world, um,
Mm.
which even then for him sort of collapses the idealism and realism, because he thinks if you have this sort of pure idealism, I am identical with the world, then uh, that ends up collapsing into realism,
Hmm.
which
It's
he
almost the
doesn't really.
univocity problem,
Yeah.
univocal
Mm.
statements.
Yeah. So I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't call him a. I wouldn't call. Well, again, it's people. Some of his friends would like to have thought that he was a Christian. There are people who want to sort of see more of that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I think it's. I don't know that I would say that. I think there are definitely elements of what he thinks about Christianity, and belief in God, that are very sympathetic, and um, things that he thought about quite deeply and was really interested in. But he even says at one point, and this gets into some of his philosophy, but he says, if I were to say that Jesus is Lord, I would have to live completely differently.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so he takes very seriously what it would be to be a Christian,
Mm.
and I think he sees that as something that he's not sure he can that that he can live sort of the authentic life,
Mhm.
with
Yeah.
the kind of demand that calls for, and the sort of duty that he would see that placing upon him.
Mm.
Um, but not like he takes it very, very seriously, I would say.
Yeah.
Um,
Huh. I imagine that's a lot of that has to do with probably reading Kierkegaard, because I feel like Kierkegaard's
Right.
pretty strong on, if you're a Christian, that's like your being is just a Christian. That's what you are. There's no parsing it out. You can't just have doctrine over here and then like living a different way. You have to like, that's a way that you can guard yourself from God is doctrine. So like I can see the
mm,
the pressure that Kierkegaard probably, if he read him a lot, put on him. So that's an interesting um, frame that Wittgenstein has about what it means to be a Christian and the weight of it. Because I mean, I think Jordan Peterson, and not to like bring him into the conversation, but he said this very similar things about like, if I was to believe that Jesus was God incarnate, then the weight of that would crush me because of the
mm,
overlap of the infinite and the finite and all this sort of stuff. So I imagine it is. I just heard a little bit of that in Wittgenstein, his view of it. So I find that very interesting that he said that or thought
yeah,
that.
yeah. He um, he's very concerned with. So for him, like the ethical is hugely sort of driving him, and that's what he saw the whole project of the Tractatus being, was an ethical project. That's how he understood it.
Mm.
And it's this idea of working on oneself, and becoming a better person. And one of his friends sort of interpreted as he could understand the sin part of the gospel. He saw himself deeply as a sinner, but
Mhm.
he didn't understand the grace part of it, right?
Mm.
That for him it was something that one did to oneself, one changed oneself, one made oneself a better person.
Yeah.
Um, and not in some kind of flippant way. Like I said, like he
Mhm.
was very ascetical at times, and was very um, intentional in the kinds of decisions that he made with these things in view. And there were a couple times he had a couple of sort of famous confessions where he went to some friends and like confessed his sins because they were bearing this burden of guilt on him, and he felt like he needed to confess them. So
Hmm.
That's it.
um,
It made me think of James K. Smith, the philosopher from Calvin College. I saw him give a lecture on Augustine. He calls him the postmodern saint. And what he does, he talks about how like all these sort of postmodern thinkers really love Augustine and they love his prescription, but not his antidote, not the medicine he also offers, right? So like
Huh.
again, Wittgenstein, like I feel like he understands the diagnosis of Christianity in the world, but he doesn't want what the actual true medicine would be to actually deal with his sin. So I just got
mhm.
that a little bit as well from that, from
Yeah,
him.
That's interesting.
I think it's almost like he would see it as being let off too easy or something.
Oh, interesting.
I don't think he would see it as a sort of license to live how you want. I think he was much harder on himself than anyone else was.
He seems like kind of a tortured
uh,
man.
Yeah.
no, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, the kind of main biography on him, or one of the biggest ones, is this guy Ray Monk. It's called The Duty of Genius. I think it really captures that, like,
Mm,
driven deeply by the sense of duty, but genius in the kind of romantic sense. Like, he was just so intense and serious and passionate and single-minded, and his friends who loved him dearly also thought he was one of the hardest people to ever be friends with, and were equally afraid of him half the time because he was just such an intense person and such a difficult person.
mm,
Um, he was a very demanding friend, as they say. So, um, but at the same time, because he was such an intense and such a gifted person, he had this charisma and this gravitas that people couldn't not listen to him. They wanted to hear what he had to say. They wanted to, um, yeah. When he would come into a room, like he would just take over all discussion. Everything would stop, and it was just people just wanted to listen to Wittgenstein.
yeah.
That's
Um,
interesting.
not
Mm,
always positively, but sometimes he
right.
did just
Right.
sometimes he did just dominate the conversation. But
That's interesting. So, now as you said, you've chosen him to have a conversation with in theology. Um, how so what is it that you think is significant for theologians or those of us who are interested in theology to understand about Wittgenstein and what he's um, capable of teaching us?
yeah, that's where I found. I mean, that's partially where I found it really personally transformative, and just totally changing the way I thought about what it meant to be a Christian.
Hmm.
Um, and you see this come out. So a few kind of different schools that
Mhm.
he's inspired pretty explicitly if you read them. But a lot of post-liberalism, which I think you guys will be pretty
Mhm.
familiar with. The grammatical Thomists, who uh, is a sort of group of people that I've spent a lot of time with in the last
Okay,
couple of
interesting.
years. But yeah, so and then you've got a lot of stuff in hermeneutics, and so a couple of major shifts. I think that one of the biggest ones theologically, for me at least, was the the rejection of the whole Cartesian ego, this whole Cartesian question of beginning with the self, who then is separate from the world, and then uh, you know goes out to interact with the world, and then skeptically or with certainty. Um,
Mhm.
and I think he basically reverses that entire relationship of the
Hmm.
whole inner and outer relationship. And so in Wittgenstein, especially in his later thought, um, it's the community which actually precedes the individual. So instead of starting with the individual and then sort of working their way out, you begin with the reality of the world and the reality of the community in which you are born into, and then
Mhm.
it's out of that that you form a self and an identity and have thoughts and concepts. And
That's
um,
interesting.
so one of his famous argument for this philosophically, people talk about, is the private language argument, and
Mhm,
he basically argues you can't have a private language.
mhm.
um, and so if you
Klingon?
uh,
No.
well, basically because you can't follow, well,
Well, there's a
let's
grammar
see.
there, and I know some nerd is gonna comment and say, "No, it's not private, it's" yeah.
Yeah, so for him, like, there's no difference between like thoughts, speaking, writing, drawing a picture of something. Those are all on the same level, right? Those are all the
Okay.
same kind of operating with symbols. There's nothing private about thoughts other than that you're not saying them out loud. You don't have this kind of special intuitive knowledge or certainty about your own mind and your own self that others don't have.
Hmm,
In fact, and we experience this in life, that sometimes others know us better than we know ourselves, right?
mhm,
Um,
yeah,
so that whole shift in thinking about then what it means to be a person, right, and is not this sort of isolated individual, but is a person who always must necessarily be in community.
mhm,
That all of my identity, everything that I am, what gives me meaning and purpose, and all these things come from a context and identity and a community, um,
Mm.
in which I'm shaped and formed, and which gives me meaningful concepts and ideas and pictures that I can work with. Um, so I think that, I mean, I think a huge one. You talked about James K. Smith and some of these. I mean, that's a lot of, I think, the
Yep.
pushback on modernity
Mhm.
is this pushing back on the
the
isolated
individual
individual.
I, yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
So
so
then,
that's a huge
because
part of
he's
that.
a linguistic philosopher, so then he's kind of seeing too that we're shaped. Because I all when I think of Wittgenstein, I always think of the language games thing, but
Mhm.
it's that we're shaped by the the way we've been socialized into language. Is that something important and significant in the way we think of the inner outer?
Yeah, totally. That we don't. So the example. I mean, this gets into his other big idea, is this idea of meaning as use, right? And
Mhm.
especially in his later writings,
Yeah.
and he contrasts this with an account from the Confessions. So he begins the investigations with this quote from the Confessions, where Augustine is talking about how he learned language by watching his parents, point to things and talk about things and reference things, and he describes it as if he sort of has a language already operating in his mind, and he's just translating from his thoughts to the language that uh, the- his parents are using and the community is using.
Mhm.
So he's beginning with his own sort of private language and then translating that into language, into
Yeah.
another language. Um, and Wittgenstein sort of pushes back on this to say, no, I mean, sure, that's how second languages work, right? But that's not how we learn first languages. Um,
Mm.
and so something like ostension, pointing and naming things, is just as much a function of language and just as much a
Semiotic.
linguistic
Yeah.
activity,
Mhm.
Mm.
yeah, as any other. And so out of that, you get the challenge to the idea that meaning is something that goes along with the word, sort of follows along with it, and that meaning is so that words are primarily names, which name things in the world. So we think, what is a dog? Well, a dog is, the word dog names this actual thing in the world, which is an animal that has these characteristics. So what is the essence of dog? Well, it's these characteristics, and we can sort of get down to the true meaning of this word.
Mhm.
And that's the way a lot of uh, right, Socratic philosophy is like, what is virtue, right?
Yes.
Well, someone gives an example. Oh, virtue's like this. No, 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 no. What is the essence of virtue? What
Mhm.
is virtue? And part of what he's showing is that there just isn't, like, that just isn't. It's just the wrong question to ask. Basically, there is no essence to a meaning or word or concept in that way. There are many different contexts in which we use and operate with words, and that the meaning of those words is a function of their use within those contexts. And so that's how you get the idea of language games. So he likes to use the example of chess a lot, right? So the meaning of a piece in chess is not the shape of the piece or the name we give to it, but it's the set of rules which that piece functions by within the game. And if we were to change the rules, we would just have a different game. It would it would be a completely different meaning.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So he's now, is he then sort of challenging his colleagues like Russell and others? Because didn't Russell have kind of an atomistic view of language? You kind of get behind the sentences and kind of rephrase them to get to smaller bits that is he searching for an essence, if you will?
Yeah. Like logical atomism was trying to get to the break language down to the most basic points. And this was basically his theory in the Tractatus, was that, you get a proposition is made up of these elemental propositions, or these atomic facts. And those name or the elementary propositions name these atomic facts. And so because you have this sort of one-to-one correlation, you can get at, you can basically guarantee correspondence. This thing really is true about this thing because they share the same form, logical form. And so it's the same idea of naming, where meaning is a function of the shape and form of the thing internal to itself, and then sort of how it corresponds to reality as something outside of it.
So
and
how does
this is kind of breaking down all of that.
So how's this change then once you switch it to use? And then, of course, I'm thinking, how does this affect theology once you switch that? Instead of getting down to the propositions that identify and name the thing, the identity relationship that you want, the correspondence of truth. If you shift it to this is how we use it, how does that affect theology? And maybe I'm going too fast. Maybe there's something
No, that's
else.
great. So I think how then we think about, so hermeneutic, well, maybe to keep it slightly more localized at first, like hermeneutics. So this is people like Hans Fry and George Lindbeck and stuff, thinking about, if you think about meaning as use, then that changes the way you come to a text. So, you open scripture and you, instead of asking, what is the meaning of, charisma?
Justification.
And what is the meaning of justification? And it has to have this, one precise meaning. And every time Paul's using it, he must be referring back to that real meaning of what the term really means, what the concept really means. Whereas a meaning is a function of use, then, yes, there'll be some overlap and similarity between the different ways Paul talks about justification. And he uses the example of family resemblances. So when you look at a family of people and, well, that sister kind of looks like that sister, but what do they have in common? Well, nothing exactly. Like maybe the eyes, I don't know. But you can just tell, you just see it. You just look and see the resemblance. And so and this is his example famously with the concept of games. So, what do hopscotch and backgammon have in common? But they're both games, right? And you can, try to come up with a necessary and sufficient definition for game, and you're always going to find a counterexample. And so the point is that that's not how we should go about looking at definitions and thinking about concepts. Instead, we should be looking at, okay, how is this word used in this context by this person? So exactly, how does Paul talk about justification in this part of Romans versus how he talks about it in this part of Corinthians, or what is he doing in this instance? And it'll probably be related to other places where he's using the word, but we shouldn't assume a kind of one-to-one correspondence, and be trying to get behind the text too. Well, what does that word really mean? Well, it just means what he's using it to mean in that context.
Yeah. What do you? So it just opens you up into the hermeneutical tradition, in a different way, it seems. So, then now Now you were, at least Charles said you'd been working on like the theology of metaphor, and it's kind of
Mhm.
funny because he doesn't strike me as a very metaphorical guy. Although I guess he does use metaphors, of course, but thought experiments or something. But can you tell me about that? I'm interested to know what you mean by that. What's going on there?
Yeah. Can I give you a couple more things for Wittgenstein or like just
Please.
theology in general first?
Yes.
Just because I think they're really interesting.
Please, yeah,
Yes.
I
please
mean,
do.
so his one of his other kind of famous dictums is this phrase he puts in parentheses: theology as grammar. So he says grammar tells us what kind of object
Mm,
anything is. Theology is grammar. So grammar is the kind of rules which govern like a game, right? The game of chess is governed
mhm,
by rules. Well, that's sort of the grammar of the game. And um, so when we want to know what is a concept, what is a thing actually, what is a thing, well, we look at how do we use it? What are the gut rules which seem to govern its use?
mhm,
Um, and so someone like George Limbeck takes this to say, okay, what is the nature of doctrine in the life of the church? Is it a set of
mm,
facts that we know, or is it a set of rules which govern the life of the church? So what it means for Christ to be Lord is not some kind of abstract fact about,
mhm,
a set of facts among other facts.
mhm,
It's a claim about the kind of life that we live as Christians, the ways in which we operate, the ways in which we spend our money, the ways in which we orient ourselves
mm,
is determined by this claim that Christ is King, and it shows itself in that claim. Or yeah, sorry, that claim shows itself in those ways in which we live, not apart from that. And so that phrase is really only meaningful. It's only really meaningful to talk about Christ as the King in the context of a community which lives as if that's the case,
oh,
with a certain kinds of
mhm,
practices
mhm,
that are, Christo kingly. um, so that's one. I think one really interesting element of it. And so for me, like one of the ideas I took away from that was thinking about faith as like a disposition.
mhm,
And he even talks about it this way himself. Like, yeah, he's a lecturer in this lecture on ethics where he says, "Faith is simply a thing we do, and only in the myth of a mental process does a believer doubt whether or not he has it."
mm,
And so it
Mm.
got me to think about not faith as like a reified thing, right? Which we often think about in reform context, think about grace and faith as like
mhm,
these objects. Do you possess this object, which is faith?
yeah, right,
And I think when you started thinking about it in terms of in a Wittgensteinian way, you start thinking that faith is not this object that you possess. It's not this immaterial thing, right? It's just it's an orientation of your life. It's a way in which you live that somebody would look and say, "Oh, that person has faith. Look at the
yeah,
way they spend their money. Look at the way they do this. Oh, like that's what faith looks like." And then when a child says, "What is faith?" Well, look at grandma. Look at
mm,
look at this saint. Look at that saint. Look at how they live their lives. Look at the ways in which they sacrifice. Look at um,
mhm,
and so you begin teaching through examples and
mhm. Community,
pictures
the
and things like that.
outside, yeah, it's like the community, the outside is shaping you, and it's not the individual I having this personal, private relationship with God. It's more how are we seeing everyone else doing it, living it, and bearing witness, and that kind of faithfulness is the
Mm,
is the place where faith is. I don't know. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
so good. S-
yeah. So in terms of my own uh, research, it's been inspired by a couple different things that kind of pointed me in this direction. One was reading certain people who were influenced by Wittgenstein. So um, some of the grammatical Thomists that I was working through, was a guy named David Burrell. There's a guy named
Can you
Cornelius
tell?
Ernst.
Can you tell us a little bit about the grammatical Thomism? I'm not sure I know, but like, and there might
Yeah.
be audience people that don't know some of the differences between the schools of thought and
So
theology.
it's kind of a loose. It's
Give us a
basically a group
lecture
of,
on. Just
yeah.
kidding.
So it's a group of Catholics.
Yeah.
Like so, second half of the 20th century, a
Mhm,
few still today. Catholics,
mhm,
several Dominicans specifically, who some of whom were direct students of Wittgenstein, So people like Elizabeth Anscombe and her husband, um, and then so Cornelius Ernst was one of his students, and then they basically migrated to Oxford, where there was a handful of people, Blackfriars, who started working with kind of Wittgensteinian stuff. So Herbert Mccabe was massively influenced by, so most of his work is just like Wittgenstein and Thomas Aquinas and like basically merged together. And so they saw in this shift towards disposition something quite akin to Aristotelianism. And so, for example, like Elizabeth Anscombe basically revived virtue ethics, which
Mhm.
then somebody like Alistair McIntyre picked up a
Yep.
few decades later. But that was basically started with her, because of the
Interesting.
way Wittgenstein talked about, uh, talked about things in this kind of dispositional way. She started seeing this similarity with Aristotle, and so people found a way of kind of rereading Aquinas through Wittgenstein as in conversation with contemporary thought. So it was a way of breaking Aquinas out of a neo-scholastic mold where it was, again, a sort of set of
Mhm.
memorized systematic theology and propositions to this much more mystical and kind of creative thinker.
Mm.
Um, and they saw Wittgenstein as sort of helping them do that. And then kind of seeing Wittgenstein in more of a theological light as well, because of that. So, yeah, I've got a few of those under my book suggestions. If
Okay, okay.
So the
there's
grammatical is
some fun stuff.
Wittgenstein. The grammatical and the Thomas is just Thomas. So you can think about it like that,
Yeah,
I guess.
yep,
Yeah,
Mm.
exactly.
cool.
So yeah, so there's a few things just reading. We're doing some work with them for my master's thesis, and just I'll do some of their stuff on analogy of language and really wrestling through that. And at several points, basically, like David Burrell basically says, really, when we use analogy, we have to use analogous words to give an and a definition of analogy. And so, really, at the end of the day, it's kind of just metaphor. You know, like he's like, you don't really have this science of analogy. You kind of end up with metaphor. And then reading Cornelius Ernst, who basically takes in a very similar direction. Uh, He says, metaphor is a typical linguistic expression of the praxis of meaning, which could itself be described as an ontological metaphor. The transference of one word into another, realized in the activity of human existence and behavior, cosmos becoming environment. So, metaphor not only as a mode of language, but as a mode of life,
Hmm.
which is logical. I'm just throwing that out there. That's too much to unpack. But basically, he's saying, really, we need to, following Wittgenstein, we need to get away from a kind of metaphysics of substance and start thinking about meaning, an ontology of meaning. And so he talks
Uh,
about God as the meaning of meaning, and so
mhm.
he's thinking about everything in terms of along those lines through Wittgenstein. But he really thinks a lot of that comes down to this metaphor, and he doesn't develop any of that. He just sort of says it in passing. And so I thought, okay, what would that be like if we could develop this account of metaphor that would both see it as something ontological, that metaphor is really saying something true about reality, um, but also could move into metaphor as a mode of life. What would it mean to have a metaphor as a mode of life? Um, so I feel like I'm sort of trying to discover what that would be
Hmm.
Wow.
uh, as my project.
Mhm.
So I want to argue first off that metaphor is constitutive of language, that language is sort of fundamentally metaphorical. And there's a few different things for that. With Wittgenstein specifically, at first glance, he uses metaphor honestly in just kind of a boring classic way. Like he talks about metaphor as a sort of substitution, and you know, you'd use a metaphor where else you could just say it more plainly. But he often rejects that explanation. Like he'll use a metaphor, and then he'll have his own pretend dialogue partner say, "Well, why don't you just say it plainly?" And he'll say, "Well, I can't. There's no
Hmm.
other way to say it." So already he has this sense of metaphors as often being irreducible,
Mhm.
but even then he treats the concept itself metaphor as a sort of classic figurative language device. But throughout the rest of his writing, this idea of a picture and an image is so intertwined with what language is and what language is doing. And then Tractatus, that's a kind of a correspondence, right? I have language, it's a picture of the world.
Mm.
And as he moves on later in his later writing, pictures become more like instruments and implements which we use in the same way that we use language. And so when he's talking about someone operating with language, he'll talk about them using certain pictures. And if we want to know what someone means by something, we'll ask, like, well, what is the application of this picture? How is this person applying it? What consequences do they draw from it? And so he sees a lot of what we're doing in our day-to-day life with language as a sort of operating with pictures.
Yeah,
that's interesting. So, not to pause you too quick. I know, Anthony, you have to go. We can keep going.
yeah.
Do you
I did
have
have
any last thing?
Yeah, I was gonna say I had just a few passing thoughts. I really like. It's amazing how much Wittgenstein has actually probably influenced me, and I had no idea. So I'm like, oh, this is just stuff I've just thought for a very long time now, and it's like I've never read him, so it's very fascinating to see how his thoughts, how much influence he actually has without me even the awareness of it, right? So like to me, like I think a lot about the Eastern iconographic tradition, to where they use the images not solely for just like aesthetic purpose, like just like it's a pretty picture or whatever. There's like teaching and didactic, and like you said, like if you want to say something plainly, you have to, you can't do that because it's sort of, which I agree is irreducible. But the way in which we understand language, I've thought this point, and even looking at icons, it's like it is itself a form of speaking and a form of language that is, we're so cognitively oriented and so word oriented in Western culture, that the idea that this kind of stuff, which I just it's funny how much I like agree with it, and I was like, it's really cool to see the sort of deep influence without the awareness of it, and how much he has shaped just my perspective on just Christian aesthetics, generally speaking, because that's a lot of how I think about right, like, so beauty, like aesthetics, like theology, like all these things to me are, they're not really different. They're all sort of the same thing in a way, but irreducibly the same thing. So I would say this is really cool, and I'm like, it's really cool what you're doing, and I'm really interested to hear more in the future when you're doing more writing and stuff. I'd love to read anything that you want to give us. I'll eat it up.
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah,
amazing.
I'll have to send you. It's not anything particularly special, but I published a paper with Boston College graduate,
Mhm.
their like graduate theology journal. That's on Jamie Smith and Wittgenstein.
Yeah, that's
That
like a sweet
you might
spot.
appreciate.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it,
that's cool.
yeah, I'm listening to some of your earlier episodes and stuff. I was like, oh, I think they would dig some of this.
Yeah, I
Just
think
because
Jamie Smith is,
I see a lot of
yeah,
overlap.
he's done a lot of work, I think, is because I'm part of a reformed context, and I think
Mhm.
he's like the best example of like sort of a good retrieval for the reformed tradition, especially intellectually, to sort of engage faith, and this stuff is not, it's not like this thing you hold tightly to, but it's like a gift, and you just sort of participate, and so the whole like Milbank and that whole scheme is also like, I'm just deeply, radical orthodoxy is just something that's really reverberated
Yeah,
with me, which is also post-liberal with like Lindback, and so all the streams, it's
yeah,
just amazing, man. Just
That's good.
it's
Yeah.
crazy, all the streams just coming together like that. I just think it's really cool. So sorry I have to bail. I got to go get my two older kids from school. So thank you
no
for
worries. I
joining
totally
us.
get it.
I appreciate it. It was good to meet you.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks for
pleasure.
joining.
Later, guys.
Nice to meet you,
See
Anthony.
ya. So, and we can keep going. I'm trying to think of the last thing you said. Now we got it off. Any comments on what Anthony said?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've discovered too. Is you know, in some level you want to be the only one working on something, because then it's like cool and niche, or I don't know, maybe I'm like
Right.
slightly hipster in that way. I'm like,
Mhm.
I want to think I've discovered some obscure thing, and in certain circles I
Yeah.
have. Most people I knew at seminary or something had never read Wittgenstein, other
Mhm.
than this one sort of obscure advanced theological hermeneutics class that everybody dreaded. uh, but but yeah, the more I sort of dive into different schools of radical orthodoxy is a lot of
Mhm,
inspiration from Wittgenstein. I think their engagement is more critical in certain places.
mhm.
Milbank's quite critical of certain things in Wittgenstein, but stuff like Catherine Pickstock's After Writing, um, or the is it After Writing, and anyway, um, yeah, her work on liturgy and writing, the uh, and then something like, I don't know, do you know Rowan Williams? And
Mhm.
are familiar with
Yes.
any of his stuff? I mean, he's very
Mhm.
much
I've been reading his
influenced by
Augustine book.
Wittgenstein, and
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
yeah, it
that's good. I'm trying to write a paper on Augustine and politics, and I like I of course, Rowan Williams is is that book is just so good.
yeah, his I just re-listened to it,
Mhm.
because I don't have a lot of time. But his Gifford lecture series that he gave a few years ago is was published as a book called The Edge of Words,
Mm,
and that was he says the outset was really influenced by Cornelius Ernst and some of his stuff,
mm.
and obviously a number of places, obviously Wittgenstein, and so that's a really cool exploring of some of these ideas, and he gets into there's a whole one on like silence, like what is silence, and
Mm.
how silence is always the space between two things. There's no such thing as a pure silence, and so he has some really cool,
So
creative,
sad.
and interesting ways in which he develops. Uh, yeah, some really fruitful ways he develops stuff.
Hmm. So, what are some, um you said you got the book recommendations, and I'm excited to hear. Where does someone start when they wanna get into, Wittgenstein? I mean, Anthony's pointed out, I mean, it's just seeping through all these authors, really, his influence. Um, but where would you start?
There's a couple. I mean, if somebody wanted to read Wittgenstein himself,
Mhm,
um, the easiest things in some ways to start with are his lecture on ethics, which is just because it's you can find
mhm,
online. It's not very long. Because that was a lecture he gave to a lay audience. Someone
mhm,
asked him to come give this lecture and was talking to non philosophers. So that's very accessible, and that has a lot more of his kind of religious and some of these more mystical ideas. Same thing with another little one called a little book called Lectures and Conversations on Aesthetics, Psychology, and Religious Belief. That's just a collection, um, but it's relatively short, and the ideas are a little less difficult to get a hold of. And it's as terms of some of his theological ideas. Those are more directly addressed. His main text is Philosophical Investigations in his later writing that was published a couple years after his death. But he had pretty much had it, in final form, ready to go. And that's kind of really that captures all of his late ideas and kind of his main ideas compiled into one book. So it's not a super easy read in terms of I don't understand what he's doing in sections
right.
of it, and a lot of people didn't and don't, and there's plenty of debate over what he is doing, or what he thinks about a particular thing. But I think it is really cool to work through it because he so
Mm,
much of his writing is parables and illustrations and examples, and what he's trying to do is to get you to basically look at it something in 50 different ways, and
mm,
realize that the one way you thought you had to look at it wasn't the only way.
mm.
And that there are other ways to look at the world, and that sort of breaks you out of the ways in which you're stuck. And so he saw so much of philosophy, and I think by extension a lot of aspects in theology, were stemming from us having these bad pictures, these misleading pictures of the way we thought the world is, and we couldn't get away from the picture, and so we couldn't look at it in a different way. So because of that, we just kept asking the same questions over and over again. And what he's trying to do with these things is to get you to look at it afresh,
Mm.
and see it differently, with the hope that you would realize that you were asking bad questions and stop asking them.
Yeah.
So his goal was not to sort of set up a philosophical system that would replace it, but just
Yeah.
to get you to see that, that's not what philosophy was meant to do in the
It's
first
not the
place.
only thing. I could
Um,
see where he'd wanna do that in the circles he was in. I mean, when you think of him following around Bertrand Russell all the time, I mean, it's not that, you know, I don't know. That's interesting. Uh, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think for anyone who's interested in, you guys talked a lot about having a background in apologetics and some of
Mhm,
the philosophy of religion conversations.
mhm,
Um, he's got a little book that's sort of like the very last stuff he wrote before he died, called Uncertainty. He died quite young. He was the day before he turned 62, of cancer, and it's the last of his kind of thoughts put together, but it's all on truth and certainty and doubt and skepticism, and I think it addresses a lot of those
the
questions and
dangers of certain.
conversations. Um,
Mhm,
yeah, both rejecting a kind of naive realism, but also rejecting skepticism. Like
mhm,
he thinks it doesn't make sense to doubt what we um yeah, there are a lot of things that just doesn't make sense to doubt, basically.
right.
Um, it's like sawing off the limb upon which you're sitting, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
um anyway, so those are kind of his works I would suggest people to read, if they want to engage with those. And then as far as kind of secondary stuff, Fergus Kerr, who's in that kind of grammatical Thomist vein,
How you spell his
he wrote a
last
book
name?
called just
Sorry.
Kerr.
Kerr. Mhm.
So
Okay.
he's got a book called Theology After Wittgenstein, and he basically uh, it's less of like an overview and more of in terms of looking at the influences, but more looking
Mm,
at particular theological developments. So some of the things I've mentioned about the Cartesian self
mhm,
and the inner and outer and those kind of things, issues around skepticism and faith and doubt, and
mhm,
even what does it mean to believe in God. um, for Wittgenstein, he's very clear that God is not an extramental reality,
that's
which
interesting.
I love when you guys are talking about the fact that God doesn't exist,
Yes.
um, because that's just like exactly the sort of thing, um,
Mm.
that yeah. I pulled up a quote from Wittgenstein that basically says that. Oh, where is it? Give me one sec. Yeah, he says in one conversation, he says, "It is a dog. Is it a dog? It is a dogma of the Roman Church that the existence of God can be proved by natural reason. And this
Mhm.
dogma would make it impossible for me to be a Roman Catholic. If I thought of God as another being like myself, outside myself, only infinitely more powerful, I would regard it as my duty to defy him." So he
Yes.
rejects this idea of this, yeah,
Yeah.
demiurge kind of thing. And then he
Yes.
says,
Mhm.
he's got another little book called Culture and Value, which I guess I'd put up there with like the lecture on ethics. But he says God's essence is supposed to guarantee his existence. What this really means is that what is here at issue is not the existence of something.
Mm.
So that's how he sort of reads Thomas Aquinas on the necessary existence of God. Is just that,
Mhm.
okay, we're not talking about existence here. Like this, whatever
Mhm.
this is, it's not existence.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's and a lot of that is like looking at the grammar of God, basically the grammar of how we
Mm.
talk about God. We can learn what a dog is because somebody can point to it. Oh, there's a
You're
dog
right.
over there. That thing with four legs and it's barking. Um,
Mhm.
when someone says, "Well, okay, well, what's God?"
Yeah, what are you gonna point
Well,
to?
what do you
People
want?
living the faith, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So you sort of the grammar and the way we
Not
talk
saying
about
that at all.
God
Yeah.
is different. Like we talk about someone who is there but is not there, someone who
Mhm.
hears us but doesn't respond, someone who
Mm.
we just have a whole different way of operating with and
Mhm.
engaging with God, which is not like any other object or person or thing or
Mhm.
um. So I think so. That's sort of looking at what is the grammar of God.
Hmm.
And that's the kind of stuff that he unpacks in that book, and it's super interesting. If somebody wants a really fun, I think, I don't know, one of the more interesting or fun uses of Wittgenstein to do theology.
Yes.
Herbert Mccabe. So he's Dominican at Blackfriars. He was a Dominican at Blackfriars in Oxford, who very literally brought together Wittgenstein and Aquinas, and he has a little book called God Matters. I don't know if it's God Matters or God Matters, because the
Mhm.
second book is called God Still Matters. But anyway, I think it was meant to be God Matters, like just topics. But anyway,
Contemporary insight. I think I found it here. Go ahead.
it's
Sorry.
very Catholic,
Mhm.
for those who are not. But I'm reading it actually with a couple Reformed guys right now, and
Mhm.
it's so stimulating. I mean, one, he's just funny. He's a really funny, amusing writer. He's really fun to read. Extremely whimsical and engaging, but just some really creative ways he takes kind of a whole linguistic anthropology, and talking about what it means for Christ to become the bread and wine, is for Christ to become our language, because that's what bread and wine are for us. They're language. They're the center of our life as human beings. Is we live and are sustained by bread and wine in
Mm.
community, because we always, we basically always eat in community, or we did, at least
Mhm.
historically. And
Right.
so what, Christ becoming bread and wine is not is Christ becoming the everyday stuff, which is our language at the core of who we are. So he does just some really creative and interesting things that I found, um, just really fruitful to wrestle with. So it's a really cool, working out of some theological issues and questions through
Mhm.
the lens of Wittgenstein.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Now, I know this too. You are a bartender and you are a beer connoisseur. I saw that because I saw on your Facebook it says that you love Jesus and beer. So yeah,
Two
my
important things
question
in
is
life.
what yes, what new beer should I try?
Ooh. Um, well,
This
I'm
is a
trying to think. I've
bubbly,
only
by the
been.
way. I wish it was but it's too early in the day.
Oh, I had a really nice, like Marzen Fest beer,
Mm.
with dinner, but that's from some tiny place down the street.
You
I don't know what's in
Is there
Wyoming,
really
I
good
have to
beer in
say.
Scotland? Yeah.
There is some really good beer in Scotland. It's fun.
Yeah.
It's funny to see. Maybe this anecdote helps. So in the States, we lived just down the street from Treehouse, which
Mm.
is sort of the great New England style IPA brewery,
Brewery. Mhm.
the great pilgrimage site. And we also,
Yeah.
regularly were up in Vermont at Hill Farmstead, and so we had exposure to a lot of incredible things.
Yeah.
And everyone's doing these super hazy IPAs, or now,
Mhm.
have you ever had any of the smoothie sours?
No, I haven't.
Oh man, they're just wild. I mean, you get things like people putting like peach rings in these, like actual peach rings.
Huh.
Or we had one brewery that would do this peanut butter and jelly smoothie sour that was like
Oh,
actually eating a
interesting.
peanut butter jelly sandwich, but in the
Mhm.
best way possible.
Hmm.
So just super weird stuff.
Wow.
Now, work bartending at a pub or at a tavern in Scotland is just a
Mhm.
totally different culture, and so
Mhm.
people come in
No
and
peanut
they
butter
want,
beers?
yeah, no, well, they want like whatever basic real ale we have on tap,
Mhm.
or their lager or whatever it is, and if it's more than like 4.5%, people
Mhm.
won't order it.
Oh, wow.
Basically, like
Yeah.
that's too much, because it's just such a different drinking culture. Like in the
Yeah.
States, we would get 16-ounce cans of
Yeah.
10% triple IPA,
Yeah.
and here it's like, I need to be able to drink 6 pints, so 3.5% is ideal.
So they just need more in quantity, you know? We
Yes, yes, exactly. It's a much more.
That's
It's just a
that's
very
interesting.
social activity, right? People come and
Yeah,
sit at the
sure.
tavern for 4 hours, and so
Right.
you know, you start out at 10%. You're not drinking for 4 hours.
No, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Well, um, yeah, thanks for joining us. Yeah, send us that paper. That'd be awesome. Um, I know both of us would love to read it. And it's in a journal, so we could post like a link to it in the notes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's it's my like second year seminary attempt at being an academic, so I can't say much for it. I don't. I'd have to go back and reread it, but I'd love for yeah. If I love for
Don't ever look at it
for
again.
some of those
That's my
connections.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
the like I said, the Jamie Smith stuff, and I
Yeah.
brought in some Alistair McIntyre in there, and just kind of trying to bring together what I thought
Mhm.
were some parallels in kind of what Smith is doing with affect and disposition and liturgy, and what that
Mm.
how that lines up with Wittgenstein on disposition. I think there's a lot of cool parallels there, which I'm sure are probably rattling around in the back of Smith's head because I know he
Mhm.
knows Wittgenstein, but it's definitely not explicit. So
Hmm.
anyway,
That's interesting.
yeah,
So, yeah, so we'll definitely check that out. Thank you for listening to Discerning the Forms. Share this on your Twitter, subscribe, like, all that good stuff. And we'd love to hear from you via email at discerningtheforums@gmail.com. Thank you so much, Austin, for joining us. This is awesome. Thank you.
yeah. Thanks for having me. That was great.